Welcome everyone. We've got an interesting lineup for you tonight, hopefully. This is our little provocation, perhaps, on the state of the Labour Party and where it might or ought to go in the future. But before we get into the details of that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've got coming up. The main thing is this. You should have on your tables a little miniature version of this poster. This is for our second annual conference. We had our first conference in Christchurch last year. It was quite successful. But this one, not to get competitive, we're hoping to be even more successful than last year, and the way it's shaping up at the moment, it seems to be tracking in that direction. We've got pretty much the whole schedule confirmed for it now. We're going to have 2 keynotes rather than last year. They just had one. We're going to have a theme, this notion of dual crisis, that New Zealand's kind of periodically gone through these simultaneous crises, and it's kind of colonial and capital foundations, and that to kind of move forward, whatever government of the day has to resolve both of those crises, and that we're in another one at the moment. So a lot of the talks that are going to be part of this conference, including the keynotes, will engage with that theme. And we're announcing that content at the moment, and we'll continue to do so over the next month or so. So kind of keep an eye on our social media for more information. Anyone can attend, you don't have to be a member. That's another difference from last year. So you can, as long as you're willing to pay the $30 and register, you can attend. It'll be over Labour weekend, 2 days, the Saturday and the Sunday. And yeah, we've got 2 keynotes. What are some other highlights? We've got a walking tour as well. They didn't have that last year. We've got a walking tour. We're going to have even parallel sessions. So some of the conference will be held here, while some of it at the same time will be held at Trades Hall on Vivian Street. So yeah, there's a few things that are going to be different this year. Anyway, that's the main kind of housekeeping related thing. So perhaps it's time to introduce our guests. So I've got here Nuruddin Abdurrahman. Sorry if I pronounced that name wrong. My name gets pronounced wrong all the time. He's a Labour Wellington City Council councillor for the Aotearoa Southern Ward. And you've probably been following his activities recently in the news, because he's been a key figure in opposing the sale of the airport shares by the City Council, which I think has been probably quite tough but heroic action that Nuruddin's been involved in. Then we've got Jim, Jim McClune, he's a professor of history at Victoria University of Wellington. He's spoken with us a number of times. We've probably got to give you like an adjunct status or something like that at this point, Jim. So Jim's also, he's done a lot of things. Probably the most relevant to this talk is he's the author of, I suppose, what's now the canonical history of the Labour Party that was published for the centenary in 2016, co-authored with Peter Franks. So he's well versed in the history of the Labour Party. And finally, online, joining us from Auckland, we have Justine Sachs, who's a trade unionist. She's an organiser for the NZNO. She's also the convener of Stand Up, which is a kind of caucus for young workers within the CTU. So they're going to each give us their perspectives on the kind of state of the Labour Party and where it might go or should go. Before this talk, I gave them a few questions to ponder, and these were the questions that also appeared in the circular for this event, so I'll read them out. I told them they don't strictly have to address these questions. It was more to get sort of them thinking and hopefully get you all thinking as well. So these were the questions I gave them. Is the Labour Party capable of progressive change any longer? The Labour Party's, its history, it actually came out of, in some ways, a breakaway from the Liberal Party, which was kind of a proto Labour Party in a way. They did a lot of kind of early progressive reforms in the 1890s and very early 20th century. Labour Party was founded in 1916, and they kind of came out of a frustration with the Liberal Party becoming a bit boring, basically. So will Labour now find itself outflanked by another party or a new party of the left? If Aotearoa is going to move beyond neoliberalism, which is our kind of current political economic paradigm, what would that look like? Is there really no alternative to the neoliberal consensus? So those are the questions I gave them, and they're each going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes about their thoughts on that, or thoughts on anything Labour Party related, really. So yeah, we're going to start with Jim. He's probably going to give us quite a historical account. Jim.
Okay, thanks Kieran. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Thanks for coming. It's always nice to be asked to speak about such topics. What I'm saying is informed by history, but I'm not going to do a history lecture. If you want, you can buy the book. Advertisement. Yeah, is Labour capable of progressive change any longer? Well, on one level, my answer is yes, of course it is, and it was in the last 6 years, if your yardstick is how much and how quickly the right-wing coalition moved to repeal and turn things upside down. But the real issue, as I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone, is how much progressive change, how bold and how enduring. And I mean, I think we can note enduring problems, the wish to be seen to be responsible, which, yeah, you'll never please Luke Belpass, but if the Labour Party is pleasing Luke Belpass, they're probably doing something wrong anyway. There were plenty of mistakes in the Ardern-Hipkins years. I think there was a lack of nerve on issues of taxation. The Fair Pay Act was passed about 3 years too late. Had it been passed earlier, it might have been embedded. And I think Hipkins' turn to centre in his brief period as Prime Minister was not at all helpful. There's a parallel in my mind between the Ardern-Hipkins governments and 1935-38. Both 1935 and 2017 were actually very fragile victories. 1935 was only 46% of the vote. The seats were much more because the right wing was split. 1938 was huge. The Savage government went to the electorate basically with the Social Security Act and everything else it had done and scored 56% of the popular vote. That's a record for any social democratic party anywhere. Likewise, 2017, as we know, was fragile in a different way, but it was fragile. 2020, for unusual reasons, gave Labour an absolute majority. As well as this sort of pressure to be respectable, I think the other big problem, and I can't remember who said this, I read it quite recently, if the National Party peddles the lie that you can have the same public services and less tax, Labour's is that you can have more for the same tax, and that's quite wrong. We know it's wrong. And so to foreshadow, we need a very serious conversation about public services and about how they are to be funded. So I think looking forward, and this merges into the third question, moving beyond neoliberalism. It's easy to say this, but I think the first thing that is necessary is to hold your nerve. You don't get anywhere by demobilising and demoralising your supporters. Lots of voters stayed home last year. Labour lost close on, or something around 750,000 votes in 2017. Now, a fair chunk of those went to the National Party, some to New Zealand First and to the Greens and to Te Pāti Māori, but about 200,000 people stayed at home. And that, I think, is indicative of a very serious problem. So if Aotearoa is going to move beyond neoliberalism, what would that look like? Well, I thought it would be most useful if I just pulled out a bit of a wish list about what the next 10 or so years might look like. 75 years to the end of the century, it's too long a horizon. Things happen. It's too long a horizon, but every baby born now, every primary school kid has a reasonable chance, we hope, of seeing the end of the century, and we hope of them seeing the end of the century in a world that is fit to live in. So, I'm trying to think about what might actually be reasonably achievable rather than totally utopian. I mean, utopia is good, but I'd like to stay with what might be reasonable. I think the first thing is we need to reshape the language around well-being. And there's a lot of good work being done by Wellbeing Economics Alliance groups, both here and overseas. Cultural, social, emotional, economic well-being. They use the word, at least my friend Paul Dalzell does, the person being able to live a fulfilling life. Not the individual, the person. That means we're all in it together. It means community. It also means a sustained effort to denormalise the language of GDP growth as the criterion of success. We know we can't do that anymore, and it's been under sustained critique for a very long time from feminists like Marilyn Waring and from environmental thinkers as well. Second, te tiriti. Iwi and Hapu are not dividing us. That is the ACT Party and Hobson's Pledge and that sort of gang. I've had the good fortune a while ago to have had a bit part in some historical research for Kaitaku in the South Island, and the transformation of their fortunes and of the landscape into Waipānamo is remarkable. It's a cliche, but that is, you know, when Māori do better, we all do better. And so again, there's a need to maintain political courage there. That said, the Labour Party's record in that field wasn't entirely negative. It means, among other things, more recognition of rangatiratanga, especially perhaps with reference to te kaiao, to the natural environment, so-called, to water, and that can only benefit all of us. I think there's some desperate need to have some conversations there. Now, I'm deliberately not talking about how constitutional arrangements might evolve. I'm sure they will, but that's a discussion that's going to need a lot of heads, and I think in any case, iwi and Hapu will have many different perspectives on that. Now, this is in no particular order, they're all important, but my third thing is deal with inequality fast. And that means looking at wealth taxes, and you know, that was a huge mistake last year to rule that out, especially when, you know, mainstream politicians like Grant Robertson and David Parker have been working on it. It means looking at income tax. It means returning to a principle enunciated in 1972, that our aim should be that everyone can participate in society, much like everyone else. That wasn't utopian in 1972. It is now characterised as such, so we need to change the language as well. We need to push the living wage, obviously. It's got some runs on the board, but there is a lot more to be done. We need, through that and through fair pay legislation, to revive the power of the trade union movement, even though that's not always an easy relationship with a Labour government, but we need to do that. And those things are part of addressing the chronic ethnic and gender wage gaps that we have. You know, like a Pacifica woman on average earns 75% of what a white male worker does. Those things are unconscionable. It also means, and I don't need or shouldn't need to say this, just leave beneficiaries alone, stop bashing them, you know, and just stop legitimising the language. 1935. Nostalgia's not a good thing, but there is a line in Labour's 1935 manifesto. Our fellow citizens are out of work through no fault of their own, and it is the responsibility of public authorities to ensure that everyone able and willing to work has a job. And again, that wasn't utopian then, or wasn't seen as such. I wouldn't rule out a universal basic income either. I think that's a conversation to have. There was a piece in the paper the other week with Eric Crampton from the Round Table telling us why it was such a bad idea. That commends it to me. So, 4, ecological crisis. Social democratic politics have got to continue to be greened. There was a start, so much more. Climate and the rest of it. Get emissions down. Stop giving licences to pollute, especially farmers, dare I say it. Overhaul transport. Now that half-price fare for public transport was a good idea, but I think Grant Robertson made a mistake in framing it as cost of living rather than environment and urban ecology. All sorts of things in that space. 5, get real about the level of public services that are expected and how they're to be funded. I referred to that before. There has to be a conversation, a serious one. 6, housing. A lot of public housing. I can't see any sensible alternative. Not necessarily all central state. That brings us into devolution, into working with communities, working with local government, and I'll be interested in Ulrik's thoughts on this, but I think we need to reflect hard about the state of local government, its responsibilities, and how it's to be funded. So that would be what I would like to think would be on the agenda for a 10-year vision. The last question that I was asked to reflect on, and I can only do that very briefly, will Labour find itself outflanked by a new party of the left? Who knows? The Alliance 25 years ago might have been that. It disintegrated for various reasons that don't need to be rehearsed. But I always thought that was a loss. I've always thought that the Labour Party needs a left-wing version of the ACT Party so that it can, it's got an excuse for doing what it really wants to do. At the moment, I can't see a new party emerging, but I do hope for an enduring working relationship between the Labour Party, the Green Party and the Party Māori. I think that's a natural and inevitable relationship. Relationships always require negotiation, but that in the short term is what I would look for. So I will leave it there. I hope some of that makes sense, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Okay, Justine.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Can you all hear me well? I'm assuming it sounds a little bit, but if not. I'll just quickly introduce myself. Ko Lithuanian te whakapaparanga mai, ko Johannesburg te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te kāinga no South Africa o ko Sax tuku whānau, and ko Justine tuku ingoa. So, my name is Justine. I'm a trade unionist. Probably going to speak to this topic from a trade unionist perspective. I think these questions are often, a lot of the debate takes place in the realm of ideology and not in terms of the actual base of the Labour Party, which, historically has been the working class. And I think to actually answer some of these questions, we have to take a more structuralist, materialist kind of view of things. So when, the question for me is asked, is Labour capable of progressive change any longer? Firstly, I would say I approach that probably as a bit of a Gramscian, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So I think it depends, and it depends on a couple of historical configurations and hinge points, and our own collective agency as hopefully, a working class movement or a socialist movement or a left-wing movement, whatever choice you got, don't really mind what you refer to it as. I think if we go back to the genesis of the Labour Party, Jim, you kind of spoke of it coming out of the Liberal Party. For me, the crux of what the Labour Party should be about is that it functioned as the political wing, the representative wing of the organised workers movement, of the trade union movement. And I think that the status and the organisation of the workers' movement reflects back the prospects of the Labour Party. I think the New Zealand Labour Party is a very interesting historical example of a social democratic party. I wrote part of my thesis on the potential for working class agency in Aotearoa, so like the ability for working people to really impact on history and be again like a viable social movement that can impact elections in an organised way. And part of the thing that really interests me is the Labour Party, the New Zealand Labour Party at least, in kind of separating it from other social democratic parties, kind of lacked a certain, this is what historians say, and I'll cite Bruce Jesson and Eric Shaw if you're interested in looking into some of this analysis, but kind of lacked a kind of intellectual rigour and was a party of interests rather than ideas. I think that's an interesting reflection that I'll talk about a little more, but I think primarily the Labour Party, even in its social democratic days, had an issue with political analysis and was primarily a party that wanted to reflect the interests of working people. But I think that there's a step above that, which is that socialist politics, which then develops from the interests of working people, which I don't think the Labour Party has ever properly developed. That's just my view. I don't think the Labour Party is capable of being a progressive force as long as the structural decline of organised labour continues. So I think the Labour Party, I sort of tend away from, I think the leftists have a very emotional relationship to the Labour Party, rooted in this idea that the Labour Party betrayed us, and it's a party that promises us things and never quite delivers on its promises. I think that's fair to say. I think a lot of people have a very emotional, Freudian, I don't know what it is, but an emotional relationship to the Labour Party, which I don't think is helpful, because I think we actually have to be able to see with clear eyes and actually analyse what we're dealing with. And I think that it is not surprising that the Labour Party isn't able to be this transformative progressive party that we want it to be. When we look at the organisation and the power of the workers' movement, I don't think that you can really expect the Labour to act without the base. And that's like the real, I think, issue, the structural issue at the heart of the crisis of social democracy, where you have this institutional decline in the base of the Labour Party, and for its own survival, it then has to pivot and become something very different, right? Not necessarily a traditional Labour Party, to become a party that potentially is a party of the middle, the more managerial class, or the professional middle class. And that's not, I think that's something that leftists take as a betrayal, and I think is actually just, in a way, a very rational decision that reflects the kind of, the terrain, the political terrain that they're operating on. If we want a workers' party, we need a vibrant and growing workers' movement. I think that it is extremely naive to think that you can go into an election campaign, that the only sort of problem that Labour has is they need to run on progressive policies. Like I really like those policies, and if I the Green Party basically, to me, just tells me what I want to hear. Labour could do that as well. But at the end of the day, there is a fundamental issue that the base is not organised. And, I think when you look at the examples of, left populism in Europe and in the rest of the Anglosphere, you see the real limitations of just thinking that we need to just run on a different platform. There's no doubt that we have to run on a different platform. There's no doubt that this would energise the section of the base. But what both Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, for example, found was the limitations of that. When so many working people have never encountered or understand, the possibilities of politics. They've never felt their own collective power. The experience of a lot of organisers trying to organise those communities in one election cycle was really evident in that, one of the key things they took away from that is that working people just didn't believe them when they talked about the utopia they could build with political power. It's because they had never felt that power in their lives. Whereas if you've got workers in unions, workers experiencing collective agency at a workplace level, workers experiencing collective agency and change and power at that level, suddenly, this level of organisation becomes almost like a little nodule that can amplify and can make possible the political aspirations at a national level. And so where the left populists did really well was these enclaves of where there were organisation, and not necessarily, I'm not necessarily saying unions are the only answer, but some form of organisation where people had been organised and they knew that they had collective power. Otherwise, I think you have a real issue, there's a real believability gap, and I think that's a real challenge that we have to be honest about, and I don't think it's just as simple as Labour running on a progressive platform. And I think we have to face that, because I think it's, as I said, so the Labour Party right now is kind of, I think, caught in a historical bind, and it's caught between being a working class party and a more sort of post-modern some people might call it professional managerial class. You've got more lawyers in the Labour, the caucus is primarily made up of lawyers. That's a real change. So when you look at the Labour, the composition of the caucus in the Savage years, it's working people, it's trade unionists, it's really representative of the working class, and that's a change. It's also less democratic, so it used to, so it's a less democratic party. I think that's a big challenge in terms of being able to make progressive change. It still is democratic to an extent, so I'm not saying it's not democratic, but it is less democratic, and I think that reflects a kind of more top-down approach that, again, reflects that historical bind. I think the Labour Party is a contested space, and that means there's always hope, I suppose. I think the Labour Party could, again, be the party of the working class. I think that institutional, historical connection remains. I think there's major issues, there's major challenges in renewing and rebuilding the base of the Labour Party, and I think it's going to look a lot different to what it would have looked like in the 1930s. And I'll talk about that a little bit in what going beyond neoliberalism might look like. But just in terms of whether Labour will be outflanked by a new party of the left, maybe. I think institution building is really difficult. We've had a lot of examples of attempts at this that have faltered or collapsed or not kind of lasted. New Labour, Alliance, Mana, Internet Mana. If you want to look overseas, you can look at Podemos, Syriza. There's a lot of examples. Most fail. It's very difficult to build parallel structures. As I said, Labour still has that connection to the organised working class and obviously resources, and resources are important when it comes to organising. I think a new left-wing party, like Jim referenced, could play an important role in pulling Labour to the left, but I think replacing Labour is a lot more of a challenge. And I don't know that we are particularly well placed for a new party. I think, that we are in a state of crisis. I think we're in maybe some of the worst political crises we've ever faced, globally and locally. And we don't have, I think we're not well positioned to create a new party because we don't have one. And I think it takes a long time, a long-term goal, a lot of institutional building to see any kind of results. I think there's questions that people need to, socialists and trade unionists and leftists need to ask, and it's like, what is more fruitful? I don't think it's either or, but is it important to contest the space? Should we, be looking at the examples of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and contesting space in Labour as socialists? Or should we be starting a new party? I think there's opportunities and limitations in both scenarios. Maybe we should do both. Maybe we shouldn't hitch ourselves to one wagon. I can't say that I'm a member of the Labour Party, so I guess I have hitched myself to one wagon, but I don't want to say with any certainty that I know the answers. As I said, I really just would, I think if I have anything that I'd like to sort of remind leftists is I just want us to be less moralistic about these questions, a lot more clear-eyed. Labour, was born as a social formation. It can change. I don't think it is one way or another. It's a dynamic, just as all the parties are. I think the conditions exist for a renewal of socialist politics, but not the organisation. And I think that is a very interesting place to be in. I think the conditions are akin to the 1930s without the organised left wing. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, basically, in terms of finding ourselves trying to, and I mean this isn't respond to the far right and attacks on the environment, Māori, trans people, just the whole workers' rights, just the whole gauntlet. That is quite frightening to me. But if Aotearoa is going to move beyond neoliberalism, what would that look like? Is there really an alternative? I think, of course, there's an alternative. I think that in some ways we are already moving into a kind of post-neoliberal order globally. I don't think that's the case in Aotearoa yet. I think this government is like the last vestiges of the neoliberal order kind of asserting itself, but I think you can certainly look to the European Union and indeed the United States and see like the reemergence of things like tariffs, the IRA, Joe Biden's IRA, the slightly more pro-Labour policies coming from those places, and certainly the protectionism, and see that we're not quite in the era of globalization and neoliberal triumphalism, that we're moving towards something a little bit different. But it's not progressive, so I think that we need to be quite clear at. Like, it's not progressive, if anything. I think we're moving into a more regressive, far-right kind of political paradigm. I think socialism in New Zealand, I think socialism in New Zealand does have a history and a rich history of socialist movements, and the Labour Party is part of that. I think when you look to, I think Aotearoa, socialism in Aotearoa is going to look something, cannot be divorced from movements for tino rangatiratanga. So I think Mai Tiki Mai is, for instance, something that socialists need to read and engage with. I think, Tau Māori is going to play a really important role in the development of what socialist Aotearoa looks like, the Māori working class as well. I think every socialist movement has to reflect the working class of the society that generates it. So leave the Soviet aesthetics at home. It's foreign and alienating. I don't have to tell you guys that, but some young people's. I think there's a lot we can learn from Latin American socialist movements that have integrated struggles against colonialism and for indigenous sovereignty into their socialist movements in really novel and really interesting ways, and they've been quite successful in terms of programs as well. So, you know, even in countries like Bolivia, even Venezuela, which I know like people would be quite reluctant to kind of look at, but have had really interesting experiments with similar kind of arrangements, and I think we don't often look to those places. I think that's an example of a kind of colonial paradigm. I think like just going back to the base and like the question of building a base for the kind of world we want to see, you know, an organised base that can fight for the world we want to see. I think the working class has a very different structure these days to, you know, the traditional industrial working class, in that it's fragmented, decentralised. We don't work in factories anymore. It's much harder to organise workers. That's why fair pay agreements were so important, because we, you know, our industrial arrangements are very regressive. It's really difficult to get collective agreements, to get unions, workers into unions. And, you know, factories are great places to organise workers. They're all there. It doesn't take a huge amount of resources. You know, we're trying to organise, for instance, hospitality workers in New Zealand. You've got like thousands of employers. It's really, really difficult and resource intensive. So I think there's some challenges that actually what we need to think through is how we do this. I feel that the industrial working class will probably play, I think, a less prominent role. I think Mike Davis, who's an amazing writer and historian, if you writes about this, and you know, like what does the sort of base look like in the world we live in now? I think the working class have been demoted but not fired from history. So I think any kind of socialist movement is going to be a configuration of social movements, including the union movement, including the working class, including Māori, including, you know, ecological movements. And I think it's important to know to kind of imagine what that looks like. That's really, I think, a good summary of what I think on this question. I think we need to kind of understand that the Labour Party is a mirror of our own power back at us. And it's time to stop thinking about power and building the working class power. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Justine. And I was just thinking when you mentioned that we should be looking more to movements in Latin America, and just again, a self-promotion, point out that one of the keynotes, maybe two, that we've organised for this conference is a gentleman from Chile who's going to be talking about the struggle against the kind of Pinochet era, like ultra neoliberal constitution, and which sort of kicked off around 2019 and led to a kind of participatory democracy style review of the whole constitution of Chile. So he's going to be talking about his experiences and lessons learned in that period of Chilean history. So got our last speaker down there.
Kia ora whanau. Thank you so much for this. And, my name is Aotearoa. And to just begin with the first question, is Labour capable of progressive change any longer? I think it is. And Labour itself was established back in 1960s. Its first campaign was good pay for the soldiers who came back from the war. And 100 years later, similar things is what Labour is campaigning for. The fair pay agreement was the big thing that happened in the last pretty long time, to be honest, at least a couple of decades. Even though now we have a government who's pushing back against all these progresses. Before the last election, when the Labour government passed that progressive legislation, as Jim said, there was a wish that could have been a bit quicker than how it went. But there was a an idea of trying to take some of the parties with it. That didn't happen, and finally it ended up in the way they even push it back again. But what is a progressive, what is a party? Is we are the one who push these parties, we are the progressives, and that is how the party guided. And the unions are who pushed it at the beginning, and that is why people like Lindy, who doing a great job in the community, would be the force, should be guiding how that vehicle looks like. If a party is, I used to be a taxi driver, so let me put it in this way. If a party is a vehicle, you need a driver, and the passengers are the one who's telling you where to go. And if we can well organized in progressive areas, and progressive policies, that is what the party represents, the people it's guiding. However, I have to admit, quite often that is not the reality. If we take the last election, every house we knock, one of the questions they ask is, what does the tax policy looks like? And when you don't have an answer to such a thing, considering a progressive values to the community that are aware of where you're heading is a pretty challenge. Do we have other alternatives? Liberals lived, I think, about 20 years, while after 108 years, Labour is still here. And even if you look at it, what that progress looks like, and under Labour, under Annette King-led Labour Party, when they had for the first time about more than 30% of women into Parliament. I think under Jacinda Ardern is when we had that 50% threshold, and more inclusive, if you look at it from the ethnic community perspective, from the Maori perspective. So that is, progressivity sometimes can be seen in the people that representing the society. Policy also, we know that's progressed in that way. Ibrahim, who worked really hard in the Fair Pay Agreement, was one of the people who came from the working family, who used to be a cleaner at Victoria University. So, however, again, as I said, Jim, I also agree with Jim when it says, I wish we have someone on the left that can knock over Labour just the same way ACT Party is doing. If you bring me to local government, one of the challenges we're currently having is what that looks like, what progressive looks like, and how can you achieve those things. Recently, we passed to sell airport shares, that we have 33% of it. And this is a council that is majority progressive or left-leaning. That campaign actually sometimes, during election time, not to sell any of strategic public assets. When the drivers that you have delivers on something that they promise, the public will go out and vote again. They will expect you to do similar promises and they will support you. But if not, there will be challenges to motivate the community. And probably it's something that maybe this to be associated to me, not to the party, why the 200 people didn't come out and vote in the last election. When it comes to, again, another party outflanking Labour Party, that has been claimed many times. And And every time we face challenges, it seems to be coming back. In the 80s and 90s, we know what happened. However, because of MMP having a party on the left is not a bad thing, but that party should be the one that can bring you to some extent to a progressive values you're campaigning for, justification, as Jim said, so you can justify some of the policies that you're doing. When you are a major party, it's also not easy because you need to take a middle kind of ground to some extent, because they said, people in academics, politics is the art of the possibility. And what that means, if you don't have the number, if it's just only FAPV first past the post, the competition will be different. When it is MMP, you need to try to get from both sides, and parties struggle in that way sometimes. And I think that is where I see the struggle for Labour as well. Again, politics is local. What we have been doing to address some of the local issues, and that is going to be really big in coming years and decades, to be honest. Currently, council depends only on the rates they charge. Unless the central government takes some stance in addressing some of the local issues, the progress that you want to achieve will not be realized. Free water was one of the ways to address those challenges. But now we know where we're ending up, and only Wellington City Council spends a big majority of for the next 10 years in the UTP. Big majority we're spending only on water infrastructure. The third question is Aotearoa is going to move beyond neoliberalism. What would that look like? We all know for the last 40 years, neoliberalism hasn't been working. And all we got is the working class suffering. And in specific to Aotearoa, the country that used to be egalitarian, it is not anymore. It's even going to be a bit of long way, even if you want to work towards that, becoming a dream. Inequality is out of control. People do not have enough. I know there are some people, maybe people like Finn spoke to, when they talk about the living wage, there are people who work 70 hours a week to survive. This is in New Zealand, just to get along. I know in the community that I used to work with, I still got a good association with the refugee communities. The husband's driving long hours, and the mom, when he comes home, she has to go out at night doing the cleaning. In this country, it's becoming very difficult even for husband and wife and living together. So the progress in the future, anything that post-neoliberalism should be something that is addressing those kind of big challenges. How we can achieve that is when we, the people, get organized and get behind the people who we can make them to be accountable, and what that looks like by itself as well. If not, it's not Labour, it's not Green, it's not anyone else, it's going to be us who will be facing the consequences. And the laborers, as I said, it's only, to use my taxi driving years, it's only the car. So we need to have the driver who knows where we're heading. We need to have the passengers who are asking for what they really want, for what they want. When the airport case started at Wellington City Council, it's the unions who stopped it back in 2021. Now again, it's unions who are doing a great job of trying to stop it. Even when politicians who claim to be part of, whether it's Green or Liberal or Independent, divert from what they promised. So it's Labour Party, it's us, that's what progressive looks like. That is what change looks like. But Labour will continue to be the force on the left. What that Labour looks like is up to us. And I'm very happy to address some of the things during question time, and Jim, to address your point about funding for local government. As I said, we have rates, we have some properties that we lease, and we have parking. Those are the only ways we currently get income. But we have so many legislation from the central government. You have to do that, you have to do this, you have to do that. Council itself pays on its own property rates. From that, the central government gets GST. But the central government got a big land in Wellington everywhere. They don't pay a penny as rates. And again, even when the Labour government tries to address some of those issues, like the sea water, carrying that back into council to address it is a challenge. And Labour government, the progressive Labour government we can have in the future, should be addressing those things in the way that is not going to be dragged like the fair pay. But to be fair as well, the fair pay agreement was a really big thing and needed a big job, and that's why it took a bit longer, but we'll continue. Otherwise, we don't have other option. More than 200 people impacted because of that fair pay agreement reversal. With that, I will leave you and happy to address some during question time.
Thanks, Narinan. Okay, I think we'll take not quite 10-minute break. We'll come back at 7:30. I might ask you guys 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll let everyone else jump in as well. So yeah, let's reconvene at 7:30. Okay, I'm just going to ask one question because I'm conscious of time, but it's I don't know if it's really it is a question. It's sort of engaging with this this kind of notion of, Tina, is there no alternative to our current so-called neoliberal paradigm? I've just been reading this book by Barry Gustafson. It's a biography of Michael Joseph Savage, who was the first Labour Prime Minister in New Zealand and in charge of a kind of famously reforming government. And this was with regards to his housing policy. And I thought, they built a huge number of state homes, partly for sale, partly for letting. And I thought the reaction from the right-wing opposition was as interesting as the policies themselves. So I'm just going to read, partly this is Gustafson and partly this is a quote from Forbes. Who was Forbes? He was Jones, the historian.
He was the Prime Minister during the Depression from 31 to 35.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was kind of part of the right-wing coalition that preceded Labour. So the national opposition was astonished by the use of Reserve Bank credit for housing, which disregarded traditional principles of budget finance. Forbes admitted confidentially to Stewart, quote, so this is Forbes, "This places the government in a unique position. The houses after erection carry no interest on capital costs, and for instance, a £1,000 house can be let for, I suppose it's 5 shilling per week and be a financial success. The millennium seems to have arrived, and it makes one wonder why we had to struggle in the bog when there was such an easy way out of our troubles. Houses, after being built with the highest paid workers in the world at the lowest cost heard of, makes our policy of orthodox finance seem almost prehistoric." End quote. Forbes concluded that he and the opposition opposition could not see any way of criticising the policy effectively because they could not see themselves what were the hidden disadvantages, if any. So there's a little bit of a technical quote, but I suppose the point that I was kind of getting at maybe there is this kind of concept of paradigm shifts that seem to happen from time to time, certainly not all the time, in politics, where ideas that have become almost part of the wallpaper that everyone accepts as sort of almost immutable, suddenly new player comes onto the scene, does something that everyone thinks is totally unorthodox, almost kind of mad, and then it works. And so could that happen again, I suppose, is kind of what I'm getting at with that original question, yeah.
Well, yeah, it can. I hope. No, seriously, I think circumstances produce responses. I think what the first Labour government did, and this is perhaps something I could have said more about, the ideas were there, the criticisms of orthodox economics were there for a while before 1935. One thing that I didn't say is that is really important for any progressive government hoping to take office is to have a fair idea of what it wants to do. And I think that was the case in 1935. But and this is sort of looking back to what Justine said before. It's actually, ideas are actually really important. I think her observation was that Labour is often a party of interests rather than ideas, and the ideas are important. And that means trying to change the common sense, trying to change the language. Might take a while, but I think that is really important. I suppose at what we have now is a whole lot of very valid discontents and less shape in terms of response to them. And so one really important task, and this is where groups like this are really important, is to try and give shape to the language and try and think of alternatives.
Well, I think try to be a mayor and end up in Wellington City Council if you... I think the challenge is, I'm not sure Jim might can correct me, but even if you just end up in that, the structure that we currently have, I'm not sure if the structure itself will allow you. I don't know about the central government, but when you look at local government, once you get into the position, even if you try to change some of those progressive policies, the advice you get and the bureaucracy, the power imbalance, the knowledge, institutional knowledge imbalance is extremely difficult. And I don't know if it's different when it comes to central government and how the cabinet and the Prime Minister's office will function in that space. But there is a possibility, and tough times can produce some of those progressive things you can dramatically change in a way. I don't know if it's a good example following the COVID and how some of the good policies implemented by the government, and if it wasn't for those policies, it's almost difficult for some people to survive in that environment. So, yeah.
Yeah, talking of COVID, I was just thinking about the borders closing. I mean, who would have imagined, I mean, it's not probably the types of changes we'd hope to be seeing again soon, but it's an example of something that's sort of unthinkable and then suddenly becomes rapidly thinkable. Justine, I think you might be working now, I'm told, by my colleague.
Working?
Yep.
Yes, excellent.
Sweet.
If you have a comment, yeah.
Yeah, I just total what's been said. I think your example is really prudent. I think what seems impossible can quickly become possible in the right political situation, and I think horizons of possibility can open up very quickly. And I think we just need to be ready to kind of jump through and take advantage of those moments. I do think the COVID, COVID was one of those moments, and I think it was one of those moments that was sadly missed by the Labour government, in the sense that I think touching on the neoliberal kind of realism within the state bureaucracy, I think that's very real, and I think you come up against it in government, and I think the public sector needs to be reformed, and part of that is really challenging that. And I think that when Labour governed, I think when Jacinda governed according to her Labour values during COVID, when all that kind of went to the side, was a moment of real potential transformation. I don't think a lot of us will ever forget. I certainly won't. I wrote about it at the time. I remember feeling like this was really the first time I'd ever felt the amazing power, the positive power of government to really intervene and shape the world and protect people. I think it changed my political imagination forever. And I think that's why there was such a huge reaction to it. I definitely think it's a possibility. I think Wellington councils are coming up against, the way that the structures have been set up to prevent that, and I think the way that, the airport sales have been presented as common sense, that kind of, neoliberal hegemony is still very real, but, we just have to grab opportunities. These fractures occur, and when they do, we have to be ready. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, I think we'll take maybe 2 questions from the floor, just in the interest of time. So please keep your questions, not statements. I don't always honour this myself, but I'm in charge.
I can't honour that, so I will sit down.
No, oh, come on, Graham. Graham.
If neoliberalism is to end, you have to organise working people. Can't do it any other way without involving working people. So I want to recount a little bit of history and pose to you the question of whether another political party is not required. 1990, we weren't allowed to fight the Employment Contracts Bill, so the most useful thing I did was went and listened to Bill Birch, who told me you can close a shop. And so we did. We closed 40 shops in our union's coverage. 2000, Labour came into office. We looked at their new bill and it said, you won't be able to close a shop. It will be illegal. That's what it said. We went to see Margaret Wilson, and she said, no, union lawyers have told us you can't close a shop under the Employment Contracts Act, and that would be going too far. Today, if you're a bus driver in Wellington, you've got as close to a closed shop as you can get, but the boss, whenever he wants to, because of the law, can have a go at you to divide your union. They've been using migrant labour to try and do that in the last few years. If the leadership of the union movement and the Labour Party do not understand organising workers, perhaps there is a need for another party to show the way. Please comment.
I think we can squeeze a question out of that.
I don't think I can improve on that observation at all.
I think you got some fair comments there, but the only thing that I would like to comment on is, if you don't like the way, example, union works, or if you don't like the way the union leadership works sometimes, you don't just abandon your union. You just get in, you organize, you wanted the union to do what you are advocating for. To use the example that you mentioned, the bus issue, I think those parties can bringing the bus to home instead of contracting out. The regional council example owning it, and the political party that understand this coming into that leadership and advocating for those kind of people who can be in that position can address those questions. If we establish a new party, is that going to be based on issues? And how many parties you're going to organize on those issue basis, and we're going to divide our resources again? That means those who can be a bit more organized can still be leading. But it's hard to respond to you, but I'm wiggling around since I'm here as a party person, so there you go.
I'll have a crack. I think it's a problem. I think politics is a problem of scale, and we know in union organising that's not good enough to have 10, 30%. You need 80 to 90% of workers to win. And I'm sorry, but 15% of the population, we need mass parties. We need parties that can organise the masses, and that is not what the left has done for a very long time. And I think that we've turned away from contesting power. When I look at the example of what the right wing of the British Labour Party did when Jeremy Corbyn got into power, and I'm not necessarily even saying this is the right move, but I think it really speaks to the difference in our relationships to power. They stayed in the Labour Party, and they waited until their moment, and then they deposed the left from power. We cede space because we, I think because we feel betrayed, or we think it's morally compromising, all very valid and fair, but is there a point where we can be a bit clear-eyed of this happened, we got outmaneuvered, how do we build power again, how do we win? We talk about the failures or the limitations of leadership. I agree. I'm totally, I think one of the gravest mistakes the trade union movement in New Zealand made was not going on a general strike to stop the Employment Contracts Act. Huge mistake. That was a leadership problem. I don't think the solution is building parallel unions, though, as has been pointed out. I don't know that the solution is leaving these spaces uncontested. And I don't want to say that I support a new party or Labour. I think a new left party could play a role in pulling Labour and pressuring Labour, so I'm not discounting that. I just think that I just think we just need to think more about power and less and more about contesting these spaces with a little bit more clearer eyes. I think that's just my view. I agree that we've been betrayed, but I can't stop thinking about how the centrists waited to depose Jeremy Corbyn, and how the minute he was deposed, the left Labour, and what has now happened in the UK Labour Party as a result. I just think it's really, I think we really need to reflect on what that says about strategy and power. That's, yeah.
Could I just make one quick observation? I think this topic and the mention of Helen Clark and Margaret Wilson makes the point that if a progressive or a progressive-minded government is embarking on significant change, there will be opposition. There'll be a lot of opposition. It'll be drummed up in the media, it'll be drummed up on Squawk Back Radio, there'll be advertisements from the usual suspects, progressive parties and their supporters need somehow to work out how to address that. And that was, Helen Clark was very good at figuring out how far she could go in the context of taking that political climate as a given, I think. Now, that might be a criticism, it might be a valid criticism, but it does raise the point that opposition will be there, and just I'll leave that there.
That's great. Okay, I think we'll take one more, and then we will, gentleman here.
Yeah, okay. I question how you came up with that number, 200,000 stayed at home, because it was 35,000 less people turned up to vote in 2020. There was a peak. It was a peak election for Labour. There's never 100% turnout based on enrolment, and the numbers actually is higher because the enrolments are higher. And when I do the calculation, it's more likely to be 150,000 rather than 200,000. And you know, I've gone to the MMP calculator. I mean, I've added all these numbers in. I've given it all to Labour, and I've added all the numbers in, and I find that we still the right is still 3% better than the left. And so I question that. I also want to go to the whole thing about the wealth tax as well, and say that, you know, I was told all these polls saying 52% of people wanted a wealth tax, but also 75% of those people didn't want it on their family home. So if they were saying there was going to be we're going to promote a wealth tax, then those people will say, it would be told by the National Party in their campaign, it's going to be on your family home, which means that number might go down to 47%. So I question, I wonder if there's a bit more to it than that. The whole idea of a party at the left, wouldn't that more take votes away from, you know, from the centre and just cause more people to go to National? So hence the swing voters again. So, you know, I think that's not here in this analysis.
Okay, well, as far as the calculations are concerned, we can debate that, but I think you said 150,000 stayed at home. I said 200,000. It's still way too many. Turnout, I think, was about 78% rather than 82%.
But I'm saying the 150,000 that turned up, that's all we're short.
Well, yeah, but it still indicates a problem. As for the likely reaction to a wealth tax, again, the part of the agenda has always got to be to get out and persuade people. And that's part of, and others, the other panellists will have things to say too, but that's partly what I was referring to, and trying to have an honest conversation about the services that we expect and how we're going to pay for them. It's all very well for the Post to run stories about the breakdown in the health system, and they do that frequently and often quite rightly. But I very seldom see any discussion of how we're going to pay for what should be done, and that's a problem.
Yeah, just on the second one, when it comes to our tax system, surely it needs to change. It's not working, but when it comes to human behavior, I'm not sure what I can say. Recently, there is a gentleman who used to be a CEO of one of the cycle action in Wellington. He advocated for a very long time, and now he came to council to oppose a cycle line that's going through the street that he lives on. So it is challenging sometimes when people ask you certain things you yourself are very passionate about, but it's a common goal. We're thinking about the society, where we want to go. Some of those policies we might not benefit from it, but we're going to do it for our children, for the country. This country will continue and will go, and whoever will be losing something, that is something they pay for the generations to come. Will that be translated to vote? I don't know. I have some friends who really disagree with some policies of the party, Labour Party, but I always see them voting Labour Party because 10 out of 9, 9 out of 10 is something they always support.
Justine, I know you've got to shoot off around now. Do you want to have a final word, or do you want to just head off?
I guess just one final thought is I think that Labour are too scared of their own shadow, and I think that might be to do with their. National are often considered the party of government, and I think Labour sometimes internalises this kind of weakness that kind of reflects in their policy, where they're really afraid to stake out certain claims and be bold. I really think they can win on the tax thing. I think none of this story doesn't make any sense, like Jim mentioned, without a tax policy that can fund essential public services. I think I actually think the public is ready for that conversation. I think the polls bear that out, and I agree people are not necessarily, people are contradictory, and you do see that in politics where, you know, once it becomes less theoretical or impacts them personally, it's very different. But I don't think that I've just been in Austria where they have 98% of workers are covered by collective agreements. They've got, you know, world-class public services. They've got 2/3 of people in Vienna. I was there for a union event. Live in public housing. I don't think that we properly emphasise how bad things have got in Aotearoa. I think we like to think of ourselves as a social democracy, and we are very, very far away from that. We are far closer to an American kind of capitalism than we are to any kind of European social democracy. And I do think there's like an underlying class resentment that the Labour Party could absolutely take advantage of. I do think it has to be underpinned by, you know, the kind of organisation of communities that I talked about. But I do think that the public is ready for a campaign that names the ultra wealthy as a source of some of our problems in our taxation system. I would rather lose on that as well than basically lie to the public about what's possible without changing our tax system. I also think like sometimes you also have to have some fundamental principles. I think tax is one of them. Yeah. So that's really, I guess, my view on that. Yeah.
That's great. Can I have the last word? Going back to this book again, I was reading it. Just what you were all saying was making me think a little bit more about some of the themes that come through in Savage's story. And he's described in this book, the author's somewhat critical of this characterisation, but it's true to some extent that there was the three of them. There was Savage, Peter Fraser, and Walter Nash. Nash was the worker, Fraser was the intellectual, and Savage was the sort of front man. He tries to challenge that story, but essentially Savage had a charisma that arguably the others didn't, and his charisma was being able to take policies that he himself knew were in many ways controversial and went against self-interest to some extent. People were being asked to pay higher taxes to pay for hospitals, better schools, etc. But he was able to kind of wrap this up into a sort of moral crusade where he asked people to kind of step out of their own narrow self-interest and work for the better of the nation, for the better of the ordinary person. And I think that's kind of where, to my mind, the Labour Party, or any other party for that matter, of the left needs to go, is to figure out how to step out on that moral crusade where recognising that people are essentially self-interested, but that self-interest, at least to some extent, can be overcome if you make a sufficiently compelling case. So anyway, thanks a lot to you all. Justine's gone, but thanks to Justine, even though she's gone, and thanks to Jim and Darren for a very stimulating and interesting panel discussion. So. I'm just also going to give them our presents. It's our latest issue of our Commonweal, which is our little magazine, which has got a lot of interesting stuff in it. It's getting better and better as it goes along. Thanks again.
Thanks, Pierre. Thanks, Pierre.